The US thought it was fighting North Vietnamese pilots. It wasn't. For decades, the standard story has been straightforward. American fighter jocks faced off against North Vietnamese Air Force pilots in the skies over Hanoi and Haiphong. The narrative is clean, heroic, the kind of thing that fits neatly into a Cold War textbook. But walk with me through what we actually know, and you'll see the official account is missing something crucial, something the Pentagon buried for years. Between 1964 and 1972, American pilots logged over 900 air-to-air victories in Operation Rolling Thunder. The official count, roughly 200 North Vietnamese fighters shot down, a favorable ratio by any measure. But here's the detail that changes everything. At least 50 of those aircraft weren't piloted by North Vietnamese at all. They were flown by Soviet pilots, combat veterans stationed covertly at bases around Hanoi, flying under false flag, their identities classified so thoroughly that some records weren't declassified until the 1990s. The Soviets called them the Night Witches, a nickname borrowed from World War II Soviet all-female bomber regiment. But these weren't women. They were elite interceptor pilots, many of them combat-hardened from Korea, rotated into North Vietnam under the cover of a technical advisory program. Their MIG-21s bore North Vietnamese markings. Their radio calls were in Vietnamese, or at least in accented Russian that sounded close enough. To the American pilots hunting them, they were indistinguishable from the regular North Vietnamese cadre. Why would Moscow take such a risk? The answer lies in the political logic of proxy warfare. The Soviet Union couldn't openly fight the Americans, that meant nuclear escalation, but they could bleed American air superiority without attribution. North Vietnam's own pilots, while brave, were outclassed. Their training was shorter, their aircraft older. By rotating in Soviet pilots, Moscow could extend the war, raise American casualties, and deny the US a quick victory, all while maintaining plausible deniability. The operational security was extraordinary. Soviet pilots rotated in for 3 to 6 month tours. They lived in segregated compounds. They flew mostly at dawn and dusk when radar was less reliable. And critically, they had standing orders. If shot down, they were to eject and be retrieved by Soviet helicopters positioned nearby. No bodies, no proof, no incident. But here's where the official story starts to crack. In 1967, an American F-4 Phantom pilot named Captain Bob Titus shot down a MIG near Hanoi. What happened next wasn't in any press release. The kill was logged as a North Vietnamese aircraft, but when photo intelligence analysts studied the gun camera footage, this telegram right here from Declassified Air Force records, they noticed something odd: the pilot's ejection sequence. The way the aircraft handled, the radio chatter, nothing screamed North Vietnamese. Intelligence officers began cross-referencing. A Soviet pilot named Yuri Skakov, call sign Red 10, had gone missing over North Vietnam in May 1967. His last known position, within 30 miles of Titus's engagement zone. The connection was never confirmed publicly. It couldn't be. Acknowledging it meant admitting the Soviets had combat pilots actively engaged against American forces. That was one escalation the Cold War couldn't survive. The real revelation came in the 1990s after the Cold War ended and the archives opened. Soviet records showed that between 1964 and 1972, at least 200 Soviet pilots flew combat missions over Vietnam. Some sources suggest the number was higher. Roughly 11 were killed in action. Their names were kept classified. Their families were told they died in training accidents or routine operations. What makes this story so unsettling isn't just the deception, it's how close it came to unraveling catastrophically. In 1967, after a particularly intense aerial engagement, American intelligence began to suspect. A Joint Chiefs memo from that July, I've seen the declassified version, explicitly raised the possibility of Soviet pilot involvement. The recommendation was to escalate, to strike Soviet bases directly if proof emerged. That escalation never happened. Why? Because both sides knew the threshold. Moscow kept the program deniable enough that Washington couldn't act on suspicion alone, and Washington, for its part, understood that confirming Soviet pilot presence would force a political response, and neither side wanted that war. So the secret stayed secret for 20 years. American pilots who'd engaged Soviet fighters had no idea. North Vietnamese officials maintained the fiction, and the Soviet Union kept rotating pilots through, bleeding American air power while the world watched and believed the narrative. The implications are staggering. Every American pilot who thought they were fighting North Vietnamese opponents was actually engaging Soviet combat veterans. The kill ratios we celebrate, they're partially inflated. the confidence in American air superiority. It was built partly on ignorance, and the war itself, it wasn't the bilateral conflict we've always been told. It was a three-way shadow conflict with one player invisible. What's remarkable is how thoroughly this was compartmentalized. Even today, the full roster of Soviet pilots who flew combat missions in Vietnam hasn't been made public. The Russians released some names in the 1990s, but historians believe the list is incomplete. Somewhere in a Moscow archive there's a classified file, names, dates, confirmed kills, and the Pentagon has its own records, also incomplete, also compartmentalized. One pilot, Nikolai Zemelyak, was eventually identified. He flew 40 missions over Vietnam and survived the war. In interviews decades later, he described the experience matter-of-factly. American pilots were good, he said, professional, but they didn't know what they were facing. That asymmetry, that secret, was the entire point. The night witches of Vietnam were never witches at all. They were cold operators in a cold war, flying under false colors, killing and dying in a conflict that official history pretended they weren't part of. Their presence changed nothing about the outcome of the war, but it changed everything about what that war actually was. The deeper lesson is about the limits of Cold War deterrence. Both superpowers were willing to risk escalation for incremental advantage, but only if they could maintain deniability. The moment attribution became certain, the calculus changed. That invisible line, that unspoken understanding between Moscow and Washington, was what kept the shadow war from becoming the real thing. What we're left with is a war within the war, one that shaped the conflict but remained invisible to those fighting it. The American pilots who came home as aces didn't know half their confirmed kills were Soviet. The North Vietnamese who claimed credit for victories they didn't achieve weren't lying so much as participating in a larger fiction. And Moscow got exactly what it wanted, a prolonged, costly war for the Americans, with its own fingerprints nowhere to be found. The archives are still opening. Researchers in Moscow and Washington continue to piece together the full scope of Soviet pilot involvement. And with each declassified document, each name added to the roster, the received history of the Vietnam War shifts slightly. What we thought we knew turns out to be incomplete, and what we didn't know, what was hidden in plain sight, turns out to have mattered far more than we realized. Subscribe. Every week we uncover the hidden layers of Cold War operations that official history forgot to mention.